I hope you all are doing well. Today I have the pleasure of introducing to you Professor Peter Singer. My name is Soy Choi and I'm extremely happy to be moderating this session today. And I'll get us started off with a brief biography of Professor Singer. So Professor Singer is an Australian moral philosopher, currently the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University. He specializes in applied ethics and approaches ethical issues from a secular, utilitarian perspective. He is known in particular for his book, Animal Liberation, in which he argues in favor of veganism, and his essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, in which he argues in favor of donating to help the global poor. He is now the author of 17 books, I believe, and the editor or co-author of 24 more. He's written about birth and death, political philosophy and globalization, and many other topics. Singer calls himself a consequentialist, as he believes that actions should be judged by their consequences. And I am very excited to hear more from him today. And just a note for our audience today, as you listen to the first part of this moderated session, please feel free to jot down your questions that you may wish to ask towards the end of this session. And Professor Singer, I will start us off with our first question.
Please do.
Yes, an initial curiosity is about your journey to becoming the philosopher you are today. When did you decide your career path, and was there a particular event or phase in life that was impactful in your decision making?
So I suppose you could say perhaps, I mean, there are more than one impactful event, I think, really. I went to university planning to study law. And as I was in Australia, we start a law degree immediately out of high school. It's a bachelor's degree. But I saw a counselor at Melbourne University who looked at my results in the last year of high school and noticed that I'd done well in a range of subjects and thought that I might find law a little bit dry. So he suggested I do a combined arts and law degree. So that's why I ended up doing an arts degree. Without that, I would probably be a lawyer or maybe a retired lawyer by now. So then, of course, I had to decide what to do within the arts degree. And at high school, we had not been able to study philosophy, so I knew very little about philosophy at that stage. But my older sister had a boyfriend who had studied some philosophy, and he talked to me about it, and it sounded interesting. So I decided to do that along with history as well, which I had done at school and had enjoyed. So that got me doing philosophy as an undergraduate. Still, I thought for a few years, for the first 3 years, that I would finish the law degree, but I never did finish the law degree. I finished the arts degree and got offered a scholarship to do further research, to do a graduate degree. And I ended up doing that in philosophy. And although, I thought, oh, well, I can always go back and finish the law degree. There's no hurry. I'll, do this. But then I got a scholarship to Oxford and studied there, which was a wonderful experience. And then I got a job at Oxford for a couple of years. So by this time I was well into philosophy and the law was not going to be ever completed and still has never been completed. I have half a law degree. But that's how I got into philosophy. It was really a chapter of different accidents, you could say.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. Thank you so much for sharing. And so now I suppose we know you as a utilitarian. And I guess in other words, a philosopher who believes we should strive in our actions to maximize the amount of happiness in the world. But for those who may not fully understand this concept, could you further explain the concept of utilitarianism as well as the specific aspects that you find important?
Yes, certainly. So as you mentioned in your introduction, I'm a consequentialist. Consequentialism is the broad family of theories into which utilitarianism fits. There can be other theories which say the right action is the one that will overall have the best consequences. And that's utilitarianism is one of those theories. And it more specifically, at least classical utilitarianism is, as you just said, the theory that says when we think about doing what will have the best consequences, we should think about the happiness of everyone affected by our actions. And when we say happiness, of course, we mean net happiness. So happiness, pleasure, enjoyment, minus whatever pain, suffering, misery is experienced. So that's the classical utilitarian view, which is pretty much the view that I take. I should also say that utilitarians have been consistent right back to Jeremy Bentham, the founder of the theory in the late 18th and early 19th century, that when we say the happiness of everyone affected, we don't only mean human beings. We mean any beings capable of experiencing either pain or pleasure. So that includes clearly many non-human animals as well.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that further explanation. On the topic, I guess, of sort of how you've gotten to be the philosopher you are today, I mean, I took a course last semester at Harvard on the topic of ancestry, and one of the biggest takeaways for me was the immense impact that family history can have on our moral views. And I'm wondering whether your family history, your ancestry influenced your view of ethics today.
It's really hard to say whether it did or not. I think as I was saying in telling you how I got to philosophy, I could easily not have done philosophy at all. I could easily have become a lawyer. I don't know what kind of lawyer I would have become. I hope I would have been a lawyer fighting for the underprivileged and for social justice. But, you know, once you get in a completely different strand of life, maybe I would have ended up a corporate lawyer defending some companies that I now think are quite reprehensible. So it's really hard to tell. And I can tell you a bit about my ancestry, certainly, but you can decide whether it had an impact. I suppose the most specific thing that could have had an impact is that I come from a family of Jewish origin, although not particularly religious Jewish family, who my parents were living in Vienna in the 1930s. The Nazis took over Austria in 1938, and my parents immediately knew that they had to leave, that they didn't think that they would be murdered if they stayed, as in fact would have happened, but they had no future in terms of their professions because of restrictions on Jews, either in business or in medicine. My mother was a physician. She graduated from the University of Vienna as a doctor. And once the Nazis came, Jewish doctors were only allowed to treat Jewish patients. And as about a third of the doctors in Austria were Jewish, but maybe only 10% of the people were Jewish, obviously there were going to be too many doctors for the small number of patients. And Jewish businessmen had to sell their businesses. They were not allowed to own businesses anymore. So they managed to get out and get to Australia, but unfortunately their parents did not leave in time. And my four grandparents, only one of them survived the war and managed to come out to Australia after the war. So I was born in 46, just after the war, but I grew up knowing about this. I grew up knowing why I only had one grandparent, whereas most of my school friends when I was young had four grandparents. And so obviously that did have an impact, but exactly what impact did it have? Maybe it made me abhorrent of racism and of authoritarian, brutal governments of the fascist kind. That probably is clear. But as I say, I think it's possible that even with that background, I might have done something quite different. And of course, there are many people who have a similar background who didn't become philosophers and work in ethics or become utilitarians.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing about your family history. And I do think that for our audience, I think hearing that might sort of connect with the work that you are doing today or not. And I guess that is up to us to sort of think about.
Yes, exactly. You can make your own decisions about what influence you think that might have had on me.
Right, for sure. Yeah. And I have had a chance to read your essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And it's a really great read, and I would definitely suggest it to everyone joining us today. This question is about, I guess, one of your positions in your essay, as well as sort of repeated in some of your other works, is that citizens of developed nations are morally obligated to give part of their income away in the form of aid. And I believe you specifically stated that a wealthy couple spends more money going to the theater than many families make in a year. Um, what is your, I guess, what is, I guess, the call to action here? Should we cut out activities like going to theaters? And yeah, that's basically a curiosity I had.
Yeah. So I know it seems hard to say this, but I do think that particularly if we're talking about really expensive Broadway shows, you'd like to go and see Hamilton or something of that sort, but it's going to cost you $300 for a ticket. I think that's questionable, given that yes, you might have one great evening, but there are hundreds of millions of people in the world whose annual income is something like, well, below 700 and $750 a year, let's say. So people on about $2 a day, which is the World Bank's line for extreme poverty. So think how much difference $300 makes to somebody whose total income is under $1,000 for the year. It means that they can have a chance to buy things that they couldn't possibly have afforded before because they needed everything that they were earning just to survive and feed their family. Now, let's say they can replace their leaky thatched roof with a corrugated iron roof, which not only will keep them dry, but in the long run will save them money because it will last 10 years or more, whereas the thatch roof has to be replaced every year. So you think about things like that, or providing bed nets for families where malaria is there so that they won't get malaria, and perhaps that will save their children dying from malaria, or people who have cataracts and have gone blind. $300 could pay for the removal of a cataract so that they can see again. So when you think about the huge differences that we can make, I do think it's questionable to spend large sums of money. And I know that's pretty demanding standard, and I'm not perfect myself, so I'm not saying that everybody has to be absolutely hardline about this. But think about what you can give to effective charities, and think about what you really need to spend, what really is going to make a significant difference to your life, your happiness and well-being, and what is maybe a luxury or a kind of a frill on the top that you don't really need.
Yeah, I think that gives us a lot to think about and sort of reflect on our ways of consumption in our daily lives. But for sure, I thought that was an interesting position.
Okay. Actually, maybe let me say one more thing, because you mentioned the essay.
Yes.
There's also a book that I've written which develops that. It's called The Life You Can Save.
Okay.
And what's more, it's available free as an ebook or as an audio book. If you go to thelifeyoucansave.org, which is an organization, a charity I founded, you can get the book, and you can also have a look at some of the most effective charities that are working for people in extreme poverty, because it's important to know which are the charities that are really going to do a lot of good with modest amounts of money, that really give best value for your money.
Right, for sure. And on that note, Professor Singer, I'm interested. How do you define effective charity? Like, what is, I guess, the standard that you and other philosophers use to determine that?
Well, an effective charity is really the one that will do the most good for whatever it is that you're putting into it, which might be money, for the simplest thing is to make a donation. So then we're talking about the most good per dollar that you donate. But maybe you don't have a lot of money, but you do have some skills, so you can volunteer to do things for organizations. And that's another thing. Again, you want to volunteer your skills and your time for an organization that will use them effectively. Now, I think that it's extremely effective to donate to organizations trying to help people in extreme poverty because of that difference that I just mentioned, the difference between how little they earn as compared to how much we earn if we're fortunate enough to be living in an affluent society. So, many people say, well, I donate to my own local community, but depending where you live and what your local community is, that might be quite an affluent one. I mean, let's say you're at Harvard and your community is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Well, yes, there are some poor and homeless people in Cambridge, but they're usually, they're getting some assistance, and often they have problems, which mean that it's really quite difficult and expensive in terms of time people need to put into them to really help them. So it's good to help them, of course. I'm not saying you shouldn't help homeless people in your own neighborhood, but you need to think that I could perhaps help many people rather than just one with the amount of resources that it would take to help one person who is homeless but has some additional problems as well.
Yes, for sure, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And now I guess I would like to move on to a question that's very relevant to all of us today. The ongoing pandemic has impacted all of our lives, I would say, with a lot of confidence to varying degrees. And it seems that the period is being extended much longer than many of us initially expected. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on the philosophical implications of the pandemic, especially in terms of equity, um, with treatment, vaccines, and everything else involved.
Yes, the pandemic has given rise to a lot of different ethical issues. And the question of equity particularly comes up, I believe, with vaccine distribution. And in fact, it's kind of a replay of what I was saying before about the differences between the affluent and people in extreme poverty in general. We see that getting played out again in the case of vaccine distribution, where the more affluent nations have had, most of them have had sufficient supply of vaccine, and the poorer nations have had very little, so that there are some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where they've only got enough vaccinations for 1 or 2% of the population, and they haven't been able to vaccinate. So it's likely that there will be more people dying there because they can't get the vaccine than additional supplies will help in affluent countries. And in fact, some affluent countries have sufficient supplies, and because some people are, in my view, very foolishly not getting vaccinated, then they actually have surplus supplies. We've been reading stories about places where they were giving away vaccines because they were expiring because people weren't taking them up. So certainly before that happens, they should be donated to countries in low-income countries that can't get enough. But the World Health Organization has a program called COVAX for trying to distribute more vaccines to low-income countries. It's certainly done some good, but it hasn't received the supplies that it would have liked to receive, and that would have been fairer and more equitable if they had been distributed to low-income countries.
Right, right. That makes, yeah, for sure, for sure. I would completely agree with that statement. And for our next question, I was regarding the pandemic as well. I was surprised going through some of your work that you had actually written about pandemics in 2015, so much before the COVID pandemic, in The Most Good You Can Do. And you talked about the risk of a serious pandemic breaking out because of the way that we treat animals. Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, certainly. This is, as you mentioned, I've been interested in the ethics of how we treat animals since my 1975 book, Animal Liberation. But that concern was about concern for the suffering of animals. But in recent years, it's become apparent that the way we raise animals, in addition to giving them miserable lives, does pose a public health risk for us. And the risk is that we now raise animals by bringing them indoors in vast sheds, sometimes 20,000 animals. Let's say we're talking about chickens, 20,000 chickens crowded into a single shed, but also pig farms are quite intensively crowded as well. And if you crowd animals together, they're stressed, their immune system may be compromised by the stress, and it's easy for viruses to develop and to spread throughout the entire building and maybe go from one building to another because there's sort of forced ventilation that pushes it out and then maybe into the next shed. So you can get viruses mutating through the animals. And then you have human handlers coming in to, at least definitely to round the animals up for slaughter, sometimes to do other things to them. And then the viruses may jump to the human beings. And before the novel coronavirus pandemic we're having now, the previous pandemic was the swine flu pandemic of 2009, which did come out of factory farms, believed to be one in North Carolina. So it's proven that viruses can emerge from factory farms, and many health experts have warned of this risk, as you say. I mentioned it in my 2015 book. So I think that we are running an unnecessary risk to public health by having animals in factory farms, and that's something we should be looking at and trying to phase out that way of keeping animals.
Yes, for sure, for sure. I think that is something to definitely consider. On this note of, like, I guess, factory farms and the way we treat animals, I'm curious if you have seen the movie Okja by chance?
No, I've read about that, but actually I never got around to seeing it. Yes.
Got it. I see. No, I just felt like the answer that you just gave, there are some overlaps with the movie. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there are from what I read about it. And I think there is more of a move against factory farming because, well, partly because of concern about animals, and it's good to see concern about animals rising, but also the rise of the vegan movement of plant-based eating, I think has made people think about the whole range of issues, animal welfare, pandemics, but climate change is another important factor. And the environmental damage that factory farms do is both local and global. So I see more people moving away from a diet that is heavy in meat consumption and moving towards more plant-based foods.
Yes, for sure. And I think that we see that, I guess, in like supermarkets that we go to, because there are so many more vegan options. The same thing with restaurants. It seems like it's now very normal for there always to be a vegan option for customers. So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's definitely a great improvement on the days when I became a vegetarian, which is now more than 50 years ago. And you couldn't get anything at most places. You had to go to a special vegetarian. Well, people didn't even really talk much about being vegan. They were vegetarian restaurants, but you had to kind of search them out. There weren't too many.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And you said it was about 50 years ago. What sort of led you to make that decision, especially when it was not a really popular concept?
No, it was certainly, you hardly thought about it. Certainly in the West. Again, it was really a chance encounter. When I was a graduate student at Oxford University, I started talking to a Canadian graduate student after a class. We'd ask questions in the class, and we had thought we'd continue the discussion. He invited me to his college for lunch, and when we'd finished talking about, I think it was about free will and responsibility that we initially started talking, I'd noticed when we came in that he had asked whether there was meat in the sauce on the spaghetti, and when he was told there was meat in that sauce, he took a salad plate instead. So that was unusual, as I say, that you didn't really meet a vegetarian. Perhaps somebody from India who was of Hindu persuasion might be a vegetarian, but it was very rare to meet anybody who was vegetarian. So I asked him what his problem was with meat, and he said something quite simple, which is something like, I don't think it's right to treat animals the way they get treated before they're killed for meat. And at that stage, I didn't really know anything much about that. I had thought that animals are all outside in the fields having a good life, but already by then, factory farming had got going, and many animals were inside in very crowded conditions, not having good lives at all.
Yes, for sure. And from my viewing of the movie Okja that I told you about, I am very well aware of what you are talking about. Of course, I probably don't know the whole story, but I do believe I know a little bit to sort of understand where you're coming from.
Right. So I wrote about that in Animal Liberation, and actually I'm currently working on revising that and bringing out a new edition, because it is a little bit dated, but unfortunately, most of the basic facts are still true.
Yes, for sure. And when can we expect the newest edition, just for our delegates?
Well, I've got to start teaching for the Princeton fall semester, so I'm not going to get a lot more done by the end of the year. So I'll probably finish it midway through next year, and that means it most likely will only be published in 2023, I would guess. Takes a while.
So that is very good to know. I guess the next question I had was, what are your thoughts on today's world's leaders? Are they moving forward or away from your moral views? And which nations sort of do you think are furthest from your position?
Yeah. So when Donald Trump was president of the United States, that country was very far from my moral views, because, as I said, utilitarianism takes a wide view. It wants to include the well-being of everybody, and even of non-human animals. It doesn't say just focus on your own country. So, it's not a matter of America first or making America great again. It's a matter of making the world great again. And so Trump was going completely in the opposite direction, and especially I think the issue of climate change is the great challenge that the whole world faces, and he was going backwards on climate change. So to that extent, I certainly welcome the Biden presidency as much closer to the kinds of moral standards that I favor. Otherwise, I think the European Union is generally going in the right direction. They are concerned about climate change. They're taking serious steps to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And on what we were talking about on animals, particularly farm animals, they're also taking some positive steps to reduce animal suffering. I think they've been the most progressive in terms of the legislation that they have passed, giving farm animals a little bit more space. Again, not all the countries are equally well governed. The countries like Hungary and Poland have moved in more authoritarian directions, but I greatly admire Merkel's government in Germany. I think she's been very courageous, including in taking Syrian refugees in substantial numbers despite political opposition. And she's certainly concerned about climate change and a range of other issues like that. So I tend to look to Europe as going more in the right direction than most other parts of the world.
Yes, I think, yeah, for sure. I think that leaves us with a lot of thinking to do about each of our own countries and the leaders of our countries, because we are a very much global audience right now. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. On a little bit of a lighter note, I read A Surfer Reflection. I think it was like a short blog you wrote back in
It
2015.
wasn't a blog; it was a column. I do a monthly column for Project Syndicate, which puts it online, but also syndicates it to a lot of other newspapers. So I'm not sure where you read it, but it would have gotten reprinted in various other media sites or newspapers around the world.
Got it. Yes, for sure. So yeah, I think I did see it reprinted as a column, I guess, on a different um, platform. But I was wondering, like, when and sort of why did you pick up surfing, and what's your favorite part about the sport?
Okay, so firstly, I grew up in Australia and lived most of my life still in Australia, where for most people, the beach is the sort of obvious place you go in the summer. So all of our big cities are on the coast. We have beautiful beaches. Not all of them have surf, but there are surf beaches usually not too far away. So I grew up swimming a lot, but not actually riding a surfboard. I would swim in the waves. I would catch waves, with flippers or with a little bodyboard. Um, but I was persuaded to try surfing only when I was in my 50s. I was at a conference, a writers' conference at a place called Byron Bay in the easterlymost point of Australia, actually, which is famous for its surf. And there was somebody there who said, at the conference, to attract me to the writers' conference, what would you like to do? And I said, well, I could go surfing if I'm in Byron Bay. So they fixed me up with somebody. I just meant sort of body surfing, but they fixed me up with somebody who was actually a surfing instructor and had been a United States national surfing champion some years earlier. And we went out once just for on the bodyboards. But he said, "Why don't you try? Have you ever tried stand-up surfing?" And I said, "No, I'm probably too old to do that." But he was very encouraging and got me a nice big board, which was easier to balance on, and I really enjoyed it. Yes, what do I most like about it? Well, I guess what I most like about it is that it's basically just you and the elements. There's no motor or anything like that you need. You just paddle out there on your board, then you wait for the right wave, and then you just use the force of the wave to give you a ride. And I really like that. And it's often, even while you're waiting for the waves, it can be very beautiful sitting out there, looking at the water, looking at the sun, looking at the coastline, seeing other people catching waves. So it's a really enjoyable activity.
Yes, for sure. I actually am also from Melbourne, and there's a Melbourne in Florida, which is my
Ah,
home.
right. Yeah, right.
Yes, also on the coast, and so
Yeah.
I started surfing about 2 years ago, so very new. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I hope
Great.
to continue.
Good.
Definitely something I really enjoy to do.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a good break from academic life and studies and reading. It's perfect way of getting away from that.
yes, for sure. I guess wow, the time is flying. But we have about 5 minutes left before we are taking in live audience questions. But before that, um, it seems from my readings about your work and other people's thoughts on your work, it seemed that some of your moral perspectives have been met with some controversy over the years. And has your moral philosophy evolved over time in response to criticisms of utilitarianism, or has it relatively remained the same? And how do you deal with the criticism?
Yeah. So there have been some changes in my views about some issues, and also some changes in the way that I put things. I think sometimes I put things in ways that were not as sensitive as they should have been. So there've been changes, but yeah, the basic utilitarian position that I hold, that that the right action is the one that has the best consequences for all of those affected, that's remained constant. I've had some changes in the views as to what I understand by best consequences, whether it's satisfying preferences, as I used to believe, or now what I said earlier about simply focusing on happiness and preventing suffering. Yes, I've had quite a lot of criticism. I think I've developed a thicker skin over the years because of the things that have been said. I don't take them too seriously, especially if they're not really attempts to produce counter arguments. There are two kinds of criticism, especially if you're in philosophy. There's the kind of criticism you get on Twitter, which is, or sometimes people send you emails, which is simply abuse, which I ignore. It doesn't bother me really at all. I know there are some people who want to vent at their disagreement, but it's not interesting if they're just being abusive. If they are trying to present counter arguments to show me why I've said something wrong, then it will depend whether they're premises that I think acceptable. For example, if they're coming from a religious point of view and they're telling me that what I've said is contrary to something in the Bible, well, I don't think the Bible is a sacred text. I don't think it's the word of God. I think it's a rather old text, which has fossilized some ideas which we shouldn't really believe anymore. So that isn't going to trouble me. But if people produce arguments why actually what I'm saying might not have the best consequences, or the consequences might not be as good as I think they are, then certainly I will take that seriously and see whether perhaps I do need to change something.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that question as well. We actually have a lot of audience questions. So I think although we haven't met the 40-minute mark yet, we'll move on to some of the questions from our audience.
Sure,
they seem to have
a
lot of
the audience.
curiosities about what we've discussed so far and about your work.
Good.
So I will just go in the sort of the order that they have been coming in. The first question is from Chinmay Srivastava. And the question is, what advice would you give to the youth who are vegan and environmentally conscious and want to actively work in the field of saving the lives of non-human animals, or even just securing rights for them?
Well, great. Yes, certainly I think what you're doing, trying to living as a vegan and as someone who's environmentally conscious and minimizing your contributions to climate change is setting a very good example. In terms of the work you can do, it's hard to advise people without detailed knowledge of their skills and interests. But there are many good organizations that you can work for, both in the animal welfare field and in the environmental field, relating to climate change, for example. And they can be good things to do. But one of the interesting novel suggestions that's come out of the effective altruism movement is that another way of contributing is to go into a field where you can earn well, and the more you can earn, the more you can donate. So, I have one ex-Princeton student, or perhaps more than one, but one I know about, who went to Wall Street specifically so that he could earn a lot of money, and has been giving away half of his income to effective charities. And because he earns more than he, would have if he hadn't gone to Wall Street, he thinks that that's the best thing that he could be doing. That's having the biggest impact for good in the world. So that's another possibility you can always think about.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing those pieces of advice with us. The next question is from Unati Rawat. And the question is, if you had to change one public policy affecting any nation of your choice, what would it be, why that choice, and how would the new policy look in your ideal world?
Yes, so the choice of just one makes it very difficult, of course, because on the one hand, I would like to have policies that, as we were talking about, that outlaw factory farming, so you can't crowd animals indoors. That would reduce animal suffering greatly. It would reduce contributions to climate change, and it would reduce pandemic risk. But I would also like to see general policies on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think we need some nations to really go hard at that and really commit to getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. Some nations have set dates like 2050 or 2045. Well, I think we need to be sooner than that, because we are already having a really bad effect on the climate, as you can see if you watch what's going on with the fires in the West or with other extreme events. So again, it's hard to know what the one policy is, but those are the kinds of things that I would like to focus on. And I also think of, well, a third thing I'll mention is that increasing aid to extremely poor nations and making that aid more effective would be another good thing to do.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree that it is difficult when it comes down to a single policy, for sure. But the next question is from Anushka Kundu. Do you believe that the world today is moving towards more extremist views as a general tendency?
Is the world moving towards more extremist views? So certainly in the United States, the Trump presidency did make things move towards more extremist views, and they are still around. They haven't gone away just because Trump is no longer president. They don't have the power of the White House, but they're still there. But I think we go through periods of fluctuation. I don't think the world is as involved in extremist views today as it was in the 1930s, for example, when fascism was growing in many countries. And on the other hand, there was Stalinist totalitarianism in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc as well. I don't think we're as extreme as that, but we probably are more extreme than we were, let's say, in 2000. I think the events of September 11th, 2001, really did move people towards more extremism, both extreme radical Islam, and on the other hand, reactions against that.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Our next question is from Timothy May Rays. A lot of youth have been interested to join or create volunteer groups due to the COVID-19 pandemic. How can young people choose effective volunteer groups to volunteer and help with?
Choose the ones that you think will be most effective. And if, for example, you're interested in extreme poverty and helping people in extreme poverty, have a look at the website of thelifeyoucansave.org. You could volunteer for The Life You Can Save itself, because it's trying to spread the message that I've been getting across. So it's trying to get more people to donate to effective groups. It's what we call a meta charity. It's not helping people directly, but helping people find the best groups that are helping people. Or you could look at the list of charities that they are recommending and think about volunteering for one of them, because they've all been carefully checked to make sure that they really are effective organizations.
Yeah, and related to that question, Lakshitha Nagesh is asking, how do you persuade today's youth to contribute and care about climate change and animal rights? I personally have had a tough time trying to persuade people of my age.
Yes, it isn't easy to persuade people to change their lifestyle, and particularly with animal rights, you're talking about people changing what they eat, and that's often goes quite deep in people. They find that hard to change. I remember when I made the change, as I said, more than 50 years ago, it wasn't that easy. But I was already married and I had the support of my wife, and that certainly made it easier. So I don't know, keep trying, keep talking to them in simple terms. Don't lecture them, don't be morally self-righteous, but point out that actually a plant-based diet is really tasty, and you feel good living on it. You feel zestful. I think it's better for you than a diet that's heavy in meat, and it avoids some of the well-known diseases of the digestive system and of the heart as well. So you can talk about the positives when you're talking about animals. And on climate change, again, let's talk about a positive future in which we have fewer fossil fuels, less meat production, but cleaner, greener energy. I think it's always good to accentuate the positive in any change.
Indeed, indeed, I completely agree. The next question is, I guess, about virtual education. Now, like since the beginning of the pandemic, education has switched to an online platform. What consequences do you believe virtual interactions have not only on education, but on human interactions and relationships in general?
Yes, that's a good question, but I'm not an expert in that area. I haven't really had follow-up. I have obviously done some online teaching, but it's obviously better than no teaching, but it falls short in some ways of in-person teaching. You don't have that closeness of contact, and for the students, I think they don't get to meet and socialize with each other either, which is a big disadvantage. So I can't really say a lot more about that or about the online world at all. All I can say is that without an online world, we would have been much more isolated over the last year and a half than we have been. So, thank goodness we have it. It's definitely better than nothing.
Yes, yes, for sure. Our next question is from Sai Kugar, who is asking, as a professor at Princeton University, is there a difference when you are teaching students versus trying to get your views to be understood by the rest of society?
Oh, there's certainly a difference, yes. For one thing, when I'm teaching students, I think it's part of my educational responsibility to acquaint my students with views that are not the views I hold, and to acquaint them with them in the strongest form. Because if you're teaching philosophy, you're wanting to teach people how to argue, and to argue, they have to be encouraged to think of counter arguments to any position that's put forward, including my own. So my students always read a range of different positions and then consider them. So that's very different from when I have the opportunity to speak on the media and I'm talking about the views that I do hold. Even now in this interview, I'm concerned to put forward my views to you. Obviously, there are people who hold different views on these issues, and if you're interested in educating yourself in argument, then search them out, and you'll find them. I think probably some of my syllabus is maybe online at Princeton, and you can look at the reading that I set for the students, which you will find different views. But if I'm assuming that most of the people I talk to when I talk to the media are not really going to use this opportunity to study philosophy as such and improve their ability to argue, but rather I'm hoping to change their lives in a positive direction, because I do think that's what's going to have the best consequences. And as I've always been saying, I think that's the right thing to do.
Yes, for sure. And our next question is from Phoebe Chan, who is asking, what are some common misconceptions about your moral beliefs?
So you mentioned controversy about my views, and perhaps the controversy that has been most prominent relate to my views about euthanasia, about enabling people to request a speedy and humane death if they're terminally ill, for example. But I've also applied that to allow parents to have the option of doing that with severely disabled newborn infants. And that's been very controversial, because some people in the disability movement believe that this indicates a prejudice against people with disabilities. But I think that is a misunderstanding. Where there are people with disabilities who are not infants and who are capable of saying that what they want, then we should try to give them as much as we can to help them to have the best possible lives. I'm totally opposed to discriminating against people with disabilities, for example, who are applying for jobs they can do or housing that they're suitable for them. We should certainly make sure that they can have the best possible lives. But when we're talking about infants who obviously can't make choices, parents, I think, are in the best position to make choices. And I got into this area because actually I was consulted by a director of a neonatal intensive care unit whose unit was saving babies from dying with severe disabilities early in life, but then wondering whether in fact that was a good thing, because when they came back later for repeated operations, their lives didn't seem to be really good ones, and also often they had a damaging effect on the family life if there were other children or the life of the parents, because they required a lot of care and a lot of attention. So, so we talked about that and came to the view that the doctors should consult with the parents. They shouldn't be making the decisions. The parents should be consulted to see what they thought about the prospects for themselves, for their existing children, and for the newborn infant. And sometimes the better decision was that they should not save the life of that child, that they should take the child off the respirator if the child was on a respirator, for example. But then once you decide that, which is pretty common practice, then you have to say, well, why is that different from actually actively ending the life of the child? If the child doesn't really need a respirator, for example, but you've decided the child's prospects are so poor that it would be better if the child died, and if the child were on a respirator, you would turn off the respirator, then maybe I've suggested parents should still have the option. That's the consequentialist viewpoint again. And as I say, I think that's been misunderstood to be seen as some kind of prejudice against people with disabilities, which I really think is not the case.
Right, right. And just a follow-up question that came in on that note is whether, like you've said, it seems like especially your views that you've shared on what is permissible for a parent to do if their child is born with a disability has been met with more controversy than some of your other viewpoints. And I wonder whether you've ever regretted wading into that topic. Because it might make people less likely to come to your other ideas.
Well, I have had moments where I've wondered whether it was the right decision to get into that topic. But in fact, in a way, that wasn't a conscious choice, because as I said, so I was the director of the Centre for Bioethics at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And the director of this neonatal intensive care unit came to see us and to consult with us about these issues. And we ended up writing something about that. But it didn't seem so controversial, at least not in Australia at that time. Perhaps this was before there was such a militant, strong disability movement. But I wrote about that in 1979 in Practical Ethics, in the first edition. And there weren't really any protests for another 10 years. The first protest came, real objections. There were disagreements, of course. There were people who had different views, but in terms of actual protests that got into the media about it, it was about 10 years before that actually surfaced. So I don't think I could have really anticipated at the time. And then, yes, there were protests. So should I have just abandoned my views? Well, I think as a philosopher, you have a responsibility to defend the views that you think are right. And although the protest maybe led me to see that I might not have been sensitive enough to the concerns of people with disabilities, they didn't persuade me that the fundamental views that I was putting forward were mistaken.
Right, right. Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. The next question is, I am curious whether you have projects that you consider unfinished business, projects that you want to return to, or things you haven't quite been able to get to that have some urgency now. What are next steps for you?
Thanks. Well, as I mentioned, revising animal liberation is certainly a step that I want to do. I think many of those issues are still very relevant, unfortunately, and I think bringing out a new edition will help to redirect attention to some of those issues. So that's a major issue. I do have a book underway about population. Is population a problem? Is it a global problem? Is it a regional problem in some regions but not others? Maybe in some regions reduced fertility is a problem, and falling population can be a demographic problem, whereas in other regions rapidly growing population may be a problem. So I have sort of project with a couple of co-authors to explore that issue and what could be an ethical response to some of those questions. And I hope to finish that sometime in the next year. Also, I should mention, perhaps of interest particularly to people from East Asia, for the last 5 years, I've been having a dialogue with Shi Chao-wei, a female Buddhist monastic from Taiwan. And we've had that dialogue transcribed. It started off as an in-person dialogue in Taiwan in 2016. We had that transcribed. Then we decided we needed to elaborate it, which we've done over in writing. But it's taken a long time. We've both been busy. Shi Chao-wei has been a dean at a university in Taiwan, as well as having many other duties. So it's taken a while, but I'm hoping that will appear sometime next year, and that's something I'm looking forward to.
Yep, and I think we will also be looking forward to that as well. But yeah, I mean, we are getting close to the end of the session, but this has been a repeated question from several people, and I guess I'll just go with Daphne Leona de Souza's phrasing, but the famous question of HPAIR goes like, what books would you recommend to young generations to broaden their horizon about environment and philosophy?
Oh, wow. Well, there's quite a few books about the environment, I suppose, that it's good to people to think about. For me, Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, was an important book about the change that our interference with the climate makes, and that's certainly something that you could be reading. About philosophy, so I've just co-edited a new edition of John Stuart Mill's book, Utilitarianism, which is kind of the classic 19th century text for utilitarianism. It's a critical edition. We do point to some areas where we think Mill's argument was not very strong, but it may be an interesting introduction to utilitarianism for people to read. And I've also I've co-edited that with a Polish philosopher, Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, and we also have a little book called Utilitarianism: A Very Short Introduction in the Oxford University Press Very Short Introduction series, which may be a good introduction to utilitarianism as well. So that's a few books to start with, but there are so many. It's really hard to know where to go. Actually, if you're interested in a book about altruism, there is where is it? It's gone somewhere. I've moved it, but there's a book called Strangers Drowning by Larissa McFarquhar that I think is a really interesting discussion about altruism in various extreme forms.
Thank you so much for those recommendations. I'm sure people in the audience will definitely be checking those out. And we are at the hour, but I would like to ask if there were any final thoughts you wanted to share before we wrapped up today.
Well, just to say, I'm glad to have had the opportunity to speak to a large audience of people who are concerned about the world and international relations. And I hope that you'll think about how to live your life in order to make the world a better place. I think that one of the main messages I'd like to leave you with is that when you do work for an important cause and try to contribute to the world, you're not only helping others, but you're helping yourself as well. Because I think it's the best way to find meaning and fulfillment in your life, is to think of a larger cause and to know that you've made a positive contribution to it.
Thank you so much for leaving us with that. And thank you sincerely for joining us today, Professor Singer. This
Thank
was
you.
truly an enlightening conversation, and I think our audience would completely agree. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day in Melbourne.
Thanks very much. And thanks, again, as I say, for the opportunity. Thank you for your thoughtful questions, and thanks to all of those in the audience, and especially those who did ask questions. Goodbye.